All right, let's talk about 10.3. What are the traits and how do psychologists use them to study personality? So, this is another form of kind of pop psychology that you've likely looked into a little bit. We've all probably taken an Enneagram, a Myers Briggs, and an MBTI, any of those. So, if you take one of those, great. If you haven't, you'll get a chance to take one this week. So, what are traits and how do psychologists use them to study personality? So, trait theory is looking at us as taking into to us some of the complexity of humans and recognizing that you can't, that basically, we want to define things, right? We want to figure out what makes people tick. And in the natural human way of things, we want to label them. We want to label a series of traits that hopefully we can then use to predict things. A good friend who serves as his career is a life coach, which is a real thing. He got a degree in Duke to do this, our master's program to become a life coach. And anytime I talk to him about stuff like this, he's always like, that stuff's good, but you got to remember you need insight plus momentum. Right? He always says insight plus momentum. So the question for traits is, sure, they give us insight and they help us understand ourselves, and that's almost always a good thing. But if it doesn't have momentum, it's useless, right? If it can't predict, if it has no value other than like, wow, I'm an extrovert, cool. What do we do with that, right? So these should be, and what psychologists want them to be, is they help us understand ourselves and what traits we have, but also they give us some idea of how we should, how that can influence the way we interact with others or our workforce or what jobs we're most suited for. So let's get into some of those. So the earliest trait theories from psychologists Alport and Cattell, and they used a statistical technique called factor analysis. We've talked about this a couple times before, but what this is it's looking for correlations across large amounts of data, in this case, across questionnaires. So trying to figure out traits that occurred together to the point that they were statistically significant, that we can't just say, those kind of correlate, but that like there's a significant correlation that we can say this isn't happening by chance. So they developed the first ever trait theory and questionnaire, the 16PF or 16 personality factor. You don't really need to know it, but just know that you do need to understand they used factor analysis to do this. So other psychologists who have done the same thing, the factor analysis to develop these, are the Isik personality questionnaire. This was the first biggie and one that psychologists still use today. And they created this X and Y axes. As you can see, if I can get my lines straightened up perfectly. They developed these two stables, X and Y axes, between extroversion, introversion. And you can see that going here along the scale, along the x-axis, and then the y-axis is stable or unstable, so that is going up and down. And so they were looking at like how extroverted or introverted are you, and also how stable or unstable are you emotionally. And they found that like where you fall on this can be relatively predictive. If you are extremely extroverted and also pretty stable in your emotions, that lends towards things like leadership. But if you are extroverted and more emotionally unstable, that can often be what's more like seen as an aggressive personality, restless or touchy. So emotional stability as well as extroversion, introversion. This is that Isik personality questionnaire. And a big finding for this one was that genetics play a big role. Extroversion and introversion, these traits are not something that are influenced in a big way by our environment. They are, for the most part, they are nature, right? They are genetics. They're passed down in that way. So even if your parents maybe are both relatively extroverted, it can happen that like maybe a recessive gene, or they both had the recessive gene for introversion and it passes down and you end up being a little bit more introverted. So extroversion, introversion is genetically influenced, as well as emotional stability. That one was a little bit more flexible based on nurture, but for both of these, they tended to be more genetically influenced. And there were findings, and when we looked at like brain scans, then again we went beyond just questionnaires for this. They looked into the biology of these. They found that extroverts had more activity in the frontal lobe when it came to inhibition. right? Or flip that, right? So like inhibition, or things that are when our frontal lobe kicks in, this prefrontal cortex, and tells us like, hey, wait, think twice about that. Introverts were better about doing that, right? Their prefrontal cortex gave them more inhibition. It slowed them down a little bit more. And we often say I think probably too often we praise extroverts, but inhibition is often needed, right? Introverts often serve very critical roles in companies and are often much more effective at what they do because of inhibition. They have a lot more of this. They have more capability to slow down, ask questions, and say, maybe this isn't a good idea. Whereas extroverts, literally their brains don't do that as much. And so they're like, this will be fine. Let's go. Let's go. Let's go. This is great. Let's great. Let's go. So dopamine related neural activity also happens a little bit more in extroverts, also meaning that when we go back to forms of like motivations, people that are looking for sensation and excitement oftentimes correlate with extroversion. This is something, again, that you would find through factor analysis. Other tests. This is one that you'll have a chance to take. One of the biggies is the Big Five factor. Costa and McCrae came up with these Big Five and said that you can't just boil it down to 2 axes. That's not enough. People are way more complex than that. We need to get it to 5 instead of 2 axes. So their Big Five model looked at what's referred to as ocean, or canoe would be a good mnemonics for it, and we'll get to those in a minute. And so they expanded out just a little bit more than what the Isik did. But it hasn't been perfect, as with most of these. Criticisms are that it doesn't explain backwards, right? And oftentimes it doesn't take everything into account, right? They said they were going to find things that they could finally define all the major factors, but they didn't really see all of them. They took out things like humor, manipulativeness, things that oftentimes we see as extremely important to recognize in humans. So it doesn't look as much into social influence, because some of these can be more influenced, right? These Isik ones are more developed genetically, whereas some of these Big Five are very nurture. So the Big Five, canoe or ocean, are conscientiousness, agreeableness, neuroticism, openness, and extroversion. Again, like the Isik, they're all scales, right? Are you very conscientious or not? Are you very agreeable or not? Neurotic or not, open or not, extroversion or not. I think I've got my scores on here somewhere. Yeah. So there's my ocean or canoe scores. Then we'll come get to those in a minute. So canoe or ocean, right? Conscientiousness, you're on the scale between disorganized and organized, careless and careful. Agreeableness, or like soft-hearted and helpful, or suspicious and uncooperative. And with most things, like locus of control, if you score like a 100 in something, if you are agreeableness 100, you're going to say yes to everything. And that's also very dangerous. That could be reworded to like naivety once you're that far up on agreeableness. I'm a pretty agreeable person. I think I scored like in the 70% or so on this. But that can often make people too trusting, right? We need to kind of balance ourselves on these, right? If you're completely calm, secure, and self-satisfied, right, that oftentimes means people that aren't going to push themselves a little bit. Right, so you need to kind of find a balance between these. Some of them are better to be more towards one or the other, but there's no right answer on these. Like with most of these, there isn't a correct. You want to be 60% extroverted, 40% open, 80% neurotic. There's no right answer on these, as with most of them. Just know that canoe, you should know the Big Five, probably recognize them, and know what they represent. Other ones, the MMPI, probably all you need to know is that acronym, Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. This one is, and this is how you should remember it, meant to assess abnormal personality tendencies, not meant to assess like how extroverted are you, how good would you be at being a teacher. These are meant to figure out abnormalities. To diagnose psych disorders. And so again, using factor analysis, they found things that were highly correlated with certain disorders. For instance, things that seem silly, you're like, how could that possibly be correlated? When you factor analysis to the degree that they did, tens of thousands of responses, we find that statistical significance. And when you look for statistical significance beyond one question, but after a lot of questions, we can see a score that can say, we can almost with certainty say this person has a high likelihood towards depression. So, as an example, a question like, nothing in the newspaper interests me except for comics. That may seem like a dumb question, but they found a high correlation between people who at the time were depressed and the likelihood of answering true on that question. So, a lot of these seem silly, but they oftentimes can help us diagnose things like depression. So here's a bunch of different like things that they've used to be able to describe and define, find the clinical connections for those. I don't need to know these again because clinical psych is not on the AP test. One that is maybe the most popular in recent history, and then of late the Enneagram I think might be passing this, but the Myers-Briggs is the one that I took throughout college and into my life. I took it my first time as a freshman in college in some like leadership organization, and I've taken it many times since. I probably take it every year now in either this class or in usually at the end of the year I like having students take it and just like talking about their findings. But it now breaks it down to four different scales: extroversion, introversion. Again, this one's biggie. It's on almost every one, which means it's probably the most important and the most studied. It's genetically connected. The second is sensor or intuitive. Oftentimes, people that are like very detail oriented or big picture. The sensors are details, intuitives are more like big picture possibility. They like big types of questions, right? So you can guess which one I am based on my love for big, open-ended Friday questions and compelling questions. I am very much an intuitive. Thinker and feeler are people that base their decisions on logic, on analysis, on like what's the most effective thing to do here, right? Like they're looking for effectiveness often, the consistency. They're looking for fairness. They're looking for once something works, stick with it because we have this like proven thing. Feelers, a little bit more all over the place. I am very much a feeler. They are a little more cooperative, and they're going to base their decisions oftentimes on other people. I'll oftentimes base what I'm doing on the room rather than what should I do that's the most effective, right? Which doesn't always work for the best, but kind of understanding these things is good. Then judgers or perceivers, the difference between judgers, people who are very organized, they make a plan, they stick to it, they are pretty comfortable with following the rules. Perceivers are open, they're a little bit more spontaneous, and they're flexible, right? They're much more like go with the flow. What's my gut? Let's go. Let's do this. So this is one that you will also be taking, seeing where you fall onto those. So the Myers-Briggs, you can see tons of different examples. It is one of the big pieces of like pop psychology. These forms, like I feel like most people know their Myers-Briggs by the time they're an adult. They've taken it at some point. I am an ENFG. Yes, the teacher, I know, but I have consistently gotten the ENFJ every single time I have taken it since my freshman year of college. I've taken two that were actually psychometrically analyzed, that were official Myers-Briggs, and they both turned out to be the ENFJ. And the same thing when I take online versions like the one you're going to take, I also get ENFJ. My wife, on the other hand, is on the opposite end of this table, about as different from me. As an ESTJ, we are both very much extroverted, and we're both very much like organized together. We want to, we're both kind of rule followers. We like structure, and we like order with things. However, the difference is that I am very emotionally driven. She is much more like logical, effective, and I am much more big picture, kind of big thinker, while she's much more like detail oriented. So I think we mix pretty well. Plus, when you compare the Myers-Briggs back to any, and you can do this for anything, like seriously, look up any pretty popular book or fictional characters. You can find a list of like all ENFJs or all ISTPs, whatever. But if you compare them into the Harry Potter, ENFJ fall would be Dumbledore, and ESTJ is Minerva McGonagall. So power couple right there. So theories, critiques around this are that it's self-reporting, right? So can you really trust people to give their best answers? Most answers say yes. Most things say that people do tell the truth. Most findings have found that people are relatively accurate in these, as long as they don't, as long as it, so it matters more. It depends on the context. They found that in the context of just taking it, people are very honest and open. But oftentimes when you do one of these before, like, because a lot of employers will ask you to do this, and they're trying to place you in a job somewhere, then people are less likely to answer some questions like, I'm easily frustrated. They'll be like, what would sound better? So if you know someone else is going to be reading it, it can change the impact or change your findings. Kind of that like the like study effect, right? Where people are, if you know that someone is observing you, the observer effect, that's what I meant to say, then you'll change your answers. So that can be a problem. And it also like they can't capture everything, right? Like I'm not really, I'm an ENFJ, yes, but if you look at the percentages on those, I'm very different on all of them, right? Like my wife and I are both extroverts, but I'm a like 90% extrovert and she's like a 58% extrovert, right? Like I want to be with people all the time. I want to see other humans. When we get to the weekend, I want to see friends. I want to go out. And Annie is like, well, maybe we could stay in tonight and then like go see some friends tomorrow for lunch and then stay back home. Like she's much more like a back and forth extrovert, introvert. You can't just say you're an extrovert, done, right? All of us are actually like, I'm 58% introverted. I am 65% this. I'm 90% this. I'm 20%. So it's you can't. We're way too complex to say that you can do these perfectly. And then a biggie and one you should probably know is the Barnum effect, which is basically like horoscopes. Any positive stock description, people are pretty likely to agree. You could get people to agree to say, how much does this, have somebody take a test and then give them some results and be like, how much do you think this is you? Most people will always say, oh, yeah, that's definitely me. Great need for other people to like and admire you. It's like, yeah, that's me. Right. So if they give you findings that say things like this, anybody for the most part is going to say, yeah, I see that. Sometimes I'm like that. We look for a confirmation bias more than anything else. So it's not perfect. That Barnum effect is whatever people say is positive or just kind of like vague, like a horoscope. Great misfortune will follow you within the next 6 months. Like something bad's probably going to happen to you. Be like, they were right. Doesn't work that way. So Barnum effect, vague stock, positive things can't be trusted. So your turn. I want you to take some personality assessments. I enjoy doing these. When I was writing this, I went back and took all of them plus some enneagrams and some disc tests because I enjoy reflecting on who I am, where my strengths and weaknesses are, things like that. So this Know Thyself assignment is on Google Classroom. You're going to take the Big Five personality assessment as well as the Myers-Briggs, and it's going to ask you to jot down some of your thoughts on those. Yes, it's me. And so I'll show you what that looks like. Pretty straightforward. Define ocean or canoe. Take the test, say what your percentages are, read the descriptions, find stuff you agree with, and then maybe something you disagree with. Same thing for Myers-Briggs, how the Barnum effect plays in. And then just the big question, do you think that there's value in taking these? If just at all, right? Do you think that there's value in taking these and talking about them? Bring your results to our next check-in, to our next Google Classroom by Friday. I want to talk about these. I love hearing what some of you are. I love playing the guessing game with people. I usually think I've done this enough. I feel like with most people, I can get 3 out of 4 with most of my students. So don't try me on that. I'm just going to Barnum effect it and say yes, I can do that without any evidence whatsoever. So with that, I will say good night, goodbye. Thanks for tuning in. As always, we've got one more screencast and then we are on to review. That's it, fam. We're almost there.